Hi all, good afternoon, and welcome to Better Together, Worker Rights and Workforce Development. My name is Morgan Polk, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at New America. This event is hosted by New America and the Good Jobs Collaborative, a diverse coalition of 13 organizations, seen on your screen, committed to reorienting workforce development policy and practice around the needs of workers for good, family-sustaining jobs. New America is a public policy think and do tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., and dedicated to renewing the American promise by continuing the quest to live up to our highest ideals. At New America's Center on Education and Labor, we research, advocate for, and provide technical assistance surrounding public policies that support education, training, and job quality. Our goal is to ensure everyone in this country has access to good, family-sustaining jobs and careers. Today, we will dig into some big questions. Should the federal government provide subsidies to companies that violate labor laws? Should our workforce development system educate workers and job seekers about their legal rights? But first, I want to explain why these questions are coming up. For over a year, Congress has been negotiating a bipartisan reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA or WIOA. In December of last year, the House Education and Workforce Committee dropped the A Stronger Workforce for America Act, which largely maintained the status quo of our workforce development system, centering the needs of business, not workers. The bill passed with little debate and strong bipartisan support, despite not making the kinds of reforms needed to drive the system toward quality jobs and better outcomes for workers. This summer, the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or HELP, released a bipartisan draft for stakeholder comment. Many Washington insiders thought we'd have a bill by the end of the summer, but then something rather unexpected happened. A provision in the Senate draft that had flown under the radar became a major point of contention. What is it? Legislative language that would require employers seeking public funding for training to disclose any recent violations of federal labor laws. The business lobby has argued against its inclusion, saying this provision will tie up law-abiding employers in red tape. But labor also stepped in. The AFL-CIO, the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, and 11 other large unions sent a letter arguing that the language is necessary to protect workers, especially given recent upticks in violations like wage theft and use of child labor. The Good Jobs Collaborative, New America, and other policy-focused organizations have supported labor in this position as well. The reality is, Democrats on the Hill are receiving immense pressure to remove this protective language as negotiations continue. In this conversation, you will hear from 3 experts about why this labor provision is so controversial and why it is so important that it remains in any future WIOA legislation. And then you'll have the opportunity to ask your own questions at the end. So throughout the event, please put your questions in the chat online. Without further delay, I'll introduce to you our panel. We have Dr. Ali Bustamante, the Director of Worker Power and Economic Security Program at the Roosevelt Institute. He specializes in how public policy can structure markets around both economic and social value and empower Americans through the provision of public goods and stronger labor protections. We have Allison Dixon, a senior instructor in the Labor Education Program at the University of Illinois. Her research centers on the modern-day degradation of job quality, especially the impacts of precarious working conditions and variable and unpredictable work schedules on worker health, well-being, families, and communities. And we have Dr. Teo Reyes. He's president and CEO of Restaurant Opportunity Center, or ROC United, where he guides and supports workplace justice, high road, and policy programs. Without further delay, let's jump in. So we can pull these slides down or move on to the next slide. We have for Ali, Roosevelt and the Good Jobs Collaborative recently released a report titled Excluding Labor Law Violators from Federal Funding Programs. Can you tell us about your piece and why you wrote it? What do you want readers to take away from it?
Thanks, Morgan, and thank you so much for being part of the Good Jobs Collaborative as well. My recent brief explores a critical accountability gap within federal workforce programs, and specifically under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Since it was enacted in 2014, WIOA allows companies with a history of labor law violations to run on-the-job training programs subsidized by our dollars. The current Senate bill draft reauthorizing WIOA, which you mentioned, includes a provision that would close that gap. The representation of compliance provision requires employers applying for federal workforce dollars to attest their compliance with federal labor laws during the past 2 years, and any violations would bar them from receiving funds. Now, guardrails like this provision are important to deter labor law violations and to promote a competitive playing field among employers. And what's important to note is that there are already several federal laws preventing businesses from receiving federal funding or engaging in specific economic activities after violating labor or financial laws, such as the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the David Bacon Act, and the False Claims Act, just to name a few. But for some reason, they're missing from the workforce development policies, and it's not like they're not needed. Just last year, the US Department of Labor recovered more than $156 million in back wages stolen from workers. The National Labor Relations Board had the highest number of unfair labor practice charges in 8 years. And two-thirds of workplace health and safety violations were classified as serious, repeat, or willful offenses. Now, guardrails like the representation of compliance provision aren't cure-alls, but they are really important in upholding the government's role in protecting worker rights and promoting ethical business practices by ensuring that taxpayer money doesn't directly support illegal practices such as child labor, wage theft, and unsafe working conditions. The thing I'd like folks to take away from this paper is that the accountability gap in WIOA is really about determining who federal workforce programs should serve. Are they primarily designed to help employers or workers? If you think that workforce development programs should be serving workers like I do, then addressing the perniciousness of labor law violations is a worthwhile start and frankly a non-negotiable condition for receiving public funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Allison, you've developed a new curriculum connecting workers' rights training to workforce development called Workers' Rights for Workforce Development. Can you share with us what that framework looks like, why it's important, and what makes it unique?
Sure. Hey, hi everyone. Thanks, Morgan. So we know that there are significant barriers impacting workers' ability to enforce their rights on the job, that workers' self-enforcement and advocacy has been shown to be shaped by three important and distinct, though interrelated, conditions: their knowledge of worker rights, their job security or lack of job security, as well as their identities. So put differently, this intersection between institutional or lack of education, organizational, lack of union representation and collective bargaining, and individual factors, worker identities, diminish workers' capacities to make complaints. Next slide. Knowledge in particular has been found to be a significant factor for enabling or constraining an individual's capacity to claim their rights on the job. And so, really thinking about what is this relationship between knowledge and action. Next, well, before we switch slides, sorry. I just want to point out the artwork that's included on this slide. This I'll be highlighting in just a little bit, this new curriculum that we've just recently published, but the artist Ricardo Levins Morales collaborated with us, and so there's all this amazing work throughout the curriculum, and so this is just one of the plates that's within. So next slide. So why do we think it's important to teach worker rights? Well, as we just heard from Ali, there is an epidemic of not only wage theft, but a myriad of worker rights violations. A study that I worked on many years ago now, 2009, we measured wage theft just in one county in Illinois, Cook County, and we were able to discern that $7.3 million is stolen on a weekly basis from workers earning low wages within our county. We also know that this is education that folks don't learn anywhere, not in high school, not really on the job, except for the mandatory postings, only really when they have a problem. And on top of this, there's, this confusing patchwork oftentimes of different protections, different minimum wages, different PTO mandates, different workers' comp. So it can be very confusing. I think employers oftentimes take advantage of that confusion. We also know, in my research directly relates to this, that worker rights awareness is a predictor of job quality. So knowledge of worker rights has this direct relationship to worker voice efficacy, which can lead to improved job quality. So why connect with workforce development? Well, workforce development folks, think about job readiness, and we really like to expand that definition, thinking about part of being job ready is knowing your rights as a worker on the job. That financial literacy should also be thinking about how to protect yourself against wage theft and other worker rights violations, and that this is a perfect partnership. My experience working with frontline staff in these organizations for many years now is that there is incredible frustration with the lack of knowledge that they have and the lack of good advice that they have to provide the folks that they're serving. And so this really kind of these partners work well together. Next slide. So here would just be a sample example, right? So you already have some of these kind of fundamental skills-based or soft skills-based trainings that they do in these workforce development programs. So, when you're reading your paycheck, learning something about kind of the different financial literacy skills, understanding how wage theft can occur, how, overtime is in this example, overtime is not being calculated correctly, but you could also identify illegal deductions and other types of violations. So very practical, hands-on applications of this type of education. Next slide. So this is just an example from the curriculum, the cover page from the third unit, which is really kind of getting into the kind of differences between worker classification. So understanding what misclassification is, understanding who's been left out from these types of federal protections, and where and how, what are these nuances, right? When you look at some of the most exploited and most vulnerable workers in our society, day laborers, workers who are getting their employment through temp agency, young workers, and then a whole group that is completely left out of protections, incarcerated workers. Next slide. So just to plug this new publication, it is available for download now from our website. It is free. It is very, very comprehensive. I think it's like 900 pages total, but you don't have to download it all at once. And so just encourage everybody to check it out. I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Allison. That's so great, and I'm excited to see more of those illustrations that you mentioned too. Teo, please tell us about Restaurant Opportunity Centers United and how the work Ali and Allison are doing connects to the workers that you serve.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Morgan, Ali, and Allison. We're proud as Rocky United to stand alongside the other members of the Good Jobs Collaborative, seeking a workforce development system that prioritizes the needs of workers. We see the value of investing in workers, both through training and strong wages and benefits, and this is something that is well documented. We've worked closely with Rosemary Batt at Cornell University to document the cost of high turnover. And even before the pandemic led scores of workers to leave the industry, restaurant turnover hovered around 45% due to the low wages and poor working conditions. We know that restaurants that do invest in training and higher wages and benefits see reduced turnover, they see greater customer satisfaction, they see greater productivity, and they see greater revenue growth. We work tirelessly to ensure that restaurant workers have a voice to demand and secure higher wages and benefits. Thousands of restaurant workers from around the country have created a vision for the future of the industry through the Restaurant Workers Bill of Rights. As you can see in this slide where we were in DC for a resolution introduction with Representative Tlaib earlier this year. This vision for the industry is grounded in thriving wages where workers are free to be themselves without fear of discrimination and unnecessary hazards, with time to rest, including vacation with friends or families, and grounded in the fact that they have a say in their workplace and in society. This is closely tied to the current administration's good jobs principles. And we've made progress in implementing the Bill of Rights. Just one example, in Michigan, we were plaintiffs in the case before the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled in our favor to raise wages and expand paid sick days, and where our members helped secure the Crown Act by educating the legislature to protect primarily Black women against bias due to their hair texture or style, and where all eligible voters have same-day voter registration. So Michigan is a good example of a state that has made tremendous leaps and bounds towards implementing the Restaurant Worker Bill of Rights. But we also know that the law is a parchment barrier, and policy change is not always enough. So we also educate workers on how to exercise their freedom of association. So for example, here you see an image of workers coming together to implement the Bill of Rights in their workplace. What you see is a majority of workers at First Avenue Entertainment in Minneapolis, where the majority of workers put their pictures on a poster and walked over to management to demand a union. The next day, the employer granted them voluntary recognition. We're not a union. We can't form unions. We don't form unions, but we are proud to educate workers on how to do so that they can go about implementing, having a voice in their workplace and having a say in the rights and the benefits and the wages where they're employed. So these efforts are really incredibly important because the restaurant industry's prevailing business model is one of low wages and labor law violations. In 2017, David Cooper and Teresa Kruger at the Economic Policy Institute estimated that workers are robbed of between $8 and $15 billion annually through wage theft. And as you can see on the next slide, nearly 40% of all wage theft occurs in restaurants and retail. Within restaurants, 14% of workers experience wage theft. And in other leisure and hospitality, it's 7% of the workforce that experiences wage theft. And in retail, it's 5%. If you look at across the states, the state with the highest rate of wage theft violations is Florida, with nearly 25% of workers experiencing wage theft. Why is this? Because it has the weakest state labor laws, and employers who do not fear getting caught are more likely to be scofflaws. Workers need to be well-versed in their rights, and we need every tool at our disposal to support enforcement, which is why this conversation is so important. Thank you, Morgan.
Thanks, Teo. So we've heard a little bit about what these federal provisions might look like. We've heard about workforce development, curriculum about worker rights, and then we're seeing how this kind of actually looks on the ground. So I'm curious from the three of you, what kind of connections are you seeing between these three different levels of work that you're all doing?
Well, I will say that we educate workers on their worker rights, and we have worked. We've certainly been greatly supported by the work of Allison Dixon and the worker rights curriculum there. One of the things that we see is that there's a tremendous need to educate workers on worker rights, and there's also a tremendous demand. We could have right now, if we had the resources, we could be training over 200 workers a day on their rights in New York alone. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to do so. So we go through orientations and through smaller groups of people that we train and educate. But there's a definite need and there's a definite interest of workers to know what it is that they're entitled to.
Thanks. So, Ali, another question for you. This would be the first time that this representation of compliance with labor laws would exist in WIOA. Why is that? And you talked a little bit about the precedent for it, but just want to highlight that again. Like, where else do we see this in federal law?
Yeah, thank you. The provision is new to WIOA because the Act has historically focused on training outcomes that fulfill employer needs and not really on enforcing labor law compliance or serving workers effectively, for that matter. The growing evidence of labor law violations and of repeat offenders really necessitates that this changes, though. Whether we're looking at the Federal Acquisition Regulations or the Davis-Bacon Act, these are all different kinds of, federal laws that look at procurement, that look at construction around federally funded projects, and all of them are already using these kinds of provisions that debar contractors with serious violations. Similar rules were also included in more recent legislation, like the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which are tied to federal incentives. Now, the goal of the new Wheel of Precision is really to expand this accountability to workforce funding as well, ensuring that taxpayer dollars are really upholding lawful and equitable practices. It's really at the end of the day, it's who is WIOA serving? Is it ultimately going to be employers, or is it really, or is it really going to be focused, unlike in the past, towards workers?
Thanks. I love just seeing that line through some of the other workforce laws and how important it would be to add it to WIOA. Teo, you mentioned a lot of some stats and some of the realities of what workers are facing on the ground. I'm wondering what you think about the timeliness of this issue. Why does it matter now?
I think this is incredibly important because of how resources are currently being distributed. And if we don't make changes, they'll be distributed in a similar manner or even worse. Our current workforce development system prioritizes the needs of employers. We know this. And the National Restaurant Association has received over $5 million from the Employment Training Administration for its registered apprenticeship program. And this is the same association that has fought tooth and nail to keep wages from rising in Michigan and has proudly crowed about it on their website. We call it the other NRA. Their lobbying efforts have been the primary force in preventing or stalling efforts to raise wages and gain paid family leave. There are 16 states where the minimum wage for tipped workers is $2.13 an hour. That means that tipped workers' wages are paid by the customer, not the employer. So the Department of Labor instituted a rule, the 80-20 rule, that stated that tipped workers had to spend at least 80% of their time doing work where they could earn tips. And the other NRA went to its Texas affiliate and challenged the rule in the Fifth Circuit so they could squeeze more free work out of tipped workers. So while the other NRA was using its legal arm to squeeze workers even further, they're receiving funding to train workers to work in these same jobs where they're desperately working to keep wages and benefits low. Now, we know that at least 20% of jobs in this industry are good enough to support a family. Most of these jobs are in the front of the house. We've documented the racial segregation in the industry through match pair audit tests and also the color line that exists between front and back of the house. Nationally, Black workers who make up 12% of the industry make up only 5% of bartenders, which is the most lucrative front of house occupation. So we know there's tremendous racial segregation in the industry. Something that is less known is the gender segregation tied to earning potential. Women make up 55% of all restaurant workers nationally, where the average wage is $15.45 an hour. But as you can see from the slide that right here, as wages rise, the percent of women in the industry declines, which is rather, nationally, again, 55% of the industry, almost 70% of servers. In cities like San Francisco and New York, where the average wage is $19.81 and $28.06 an hour, women make up around 35% of the industry and about 45% of servers. So our child pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship program seeks to redress this imbalance by ensuring that workers who are excluded from the industry, who don't have the same opportunities, have an opportunity to grow and build a career path. As the next slide shows, here's an image from one of our graduating classes earlier this year in Brooklyn. That's a pre-apprenticeship class. We're currently working to get an apprenticeship program, a registered apprenticeship program that's currently in comment period in New York State. And once we implement it, we'll be able to support workers in advancing up the ladder into high earning potential jobs that they've been excluded from. But we really can't do it if we always only geared towards the interests of employers, because they'll keep funneling money towards the National Restaurant Association instead of towards worker centers and other community-based organizations that are doing workforce development work on the ground. Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing those examples. I'm going to pop it over to Allison and ask what some of the biggest points you think people should know from your research, from your work developing this curriculum. Um, and like, that can be anyone. That's people tuning in to this webinar. It's also federal and state policymakers. I know a lot of us are focused on policy specifically. I'm just wondering how people can support efforts like yours, how federal and state policymakers can too.
Well, I think that, a good first step is bringing these three speakers together because I think we all represent very different important pieces of this puzzle, right? That, well, we believe that pro-worker advocacy, organizing legislation is vital, but not sufficient. That in these times where access to reliable fact-based information is lacking or siloed, that thoughtful consideration of spaces where worker rights education can occur, as well as education focused on worker organizing and collective actions for improving working conditions, that's really fundamental. Oftentimes we in Illinois, we see amazing pro-worker legislation passed at the city, county, and state level. But then, the follow-up pieces are missing. The concerted popular education effort, the robust enforcement of these laws, right? And so all these pieces are vital. And so I think that, I really like to think about where are all the places where this information, this type of education fits. Workforce development is where we started just because, not because that was my background at all, but I was like, okay, who is serving in a large way the folks that we know are most at risk for these violations and already talking about work and assembling people in a classroom setting, right? That just seems like a very good spot to be talking about worker rights. But there are many, many other spaces besides that. I mean, I really would like to be thinking a lot more about how do we bring this information to high school students. High school juniors and seniors in Illinois in public schools have to go through financial literacy as well. They have to go through workplace readiness. And so that's a wonderful spot to have a conversation about worker rights. And so I I think that what I would like folks to take away, at least from my contribution today, is that even if you're not engaged directly in workforce development work, that we've designed this curriculum keeping you in mind and making sure that it is accessible to as large an audience as possible, right? So there is a large menu of different types of learning methods that's in the introductory unit, recognizing that like not everybody learns best from reading, that not everybody has English as their first language, right? And so you need to have this type of information accessible for everybody, right? And so hopefully, that would be I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, there probably should be something for everybody included within. Sorry, somebody is making a loud sound outside my back door. Yeah, so yeah, that would be what I would say is just kind of really, thinking creatively about where else can you plug in this type of education.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I'm going to pause right here and just remind folks tuning in to submit your questions in the chat. It is not very often that you get to ask folks who are doing this work so deeply your questions to understand why it's important, to clarify something. So definitely take advantage of that opportunity. I think I'm gonna double click for Allison. So you talked about, maybe including this in high schools. Also, this is relevant for workers, but I'm wondering, like who else could benefit from reading it? If it's not just the people who are, in workforce development programs, like are there other applications for this curriculum?
Absolutely. And so I think that recognizing that this is not information that any of us really learn, not in any sort of concerted way, right? I would say that probably everybody on this call, well, maybe maybe not the speakers, but probably even a lot of the people who are tuning in could benefit from a read through. And so yeah, like as I was saying before, I think just thinking about creatively about where it can be adapted. We teach this stuff, have the opportunity to teach it in classrooms where people are learning English. Especially thinking about kind of some of these bridge programs where people are learning maybe a career in healthcare or in restaurant industry, right? What are the specific ways that you can talk about the laws and protections and types of violations you see in these different industries? I think that, pretty much every community space, as captain of my block that I live on, I feel like I've done this presentation for my neighbors. Um, I have done it in front of many different religious groups, church groups. And so I think the common denominator being that like most of us are workers and not bosses, right?
Awesome. Thanks so much. Ali, something that we've heard from the business community about these protective provision in WIOA is that, businesses already face financial penalties when they violate labor law. Is that enough? Why is it or why is it not?
Yes, definitely. First off, it's certainly not enough. It's certainly not enough to deter labor law violations. And the reason is because the penalties are typically too small to outweigh the financial benefits of noncompliance. Companies view these fines as manageable costs of doing business rather than serious consequences. One example I often bring up is that the maximum fine, again, not the minimum, but the maximum fine for a worker's death due to a safety violation is around $14,000. When we think about wage theft penalties, they're as low as $2,500 per infraction. And so these amounts are really insignificant compared to the potential savings from underpaying workers or ignoring safety standards, especially for larger companies who, again, really built these kinds of labor law violations as part of their business practices. The second part I would also add to that is that enforcement agencies, whether it's a Department of Labor's, investigators that are looking at, the occupational health and safety, or whether they're, upholding the Federal Labor Standards Act, or even when we're thinking about, the National Labor Relations Board or the Equal Opportunity Commission, all of these organizations are just really underfunded and understaffed. And they have just really limited ability to thoroughly investigate and penalize offenders. And that's why, it's a really critical need, as Allison mentioned, that workers know their rights to begin with, so they can so that they have that awareness of when they're being exploited or taken advantage of, because the very glaring reality that we have is that many violations are just going unchecked or are settled for just very minimal fines. And this is just about what we do know, right? So the more that again workers have this greater awareness of their rights, and really at the second at the second level, in terms of the more that we can make sure that agencies that are really in charge of this enforcement are funded adequately, and so that these enforcement mechanisms are working as they should be. And as I mentioned earlier, these enforcement mechanisms that we have in the books, they're not so very strong to begin with. And that's why things like the representation of compliance provision and other kinds of guardrails are just really needed to really shore up the labor law infrastructure that we currently have in this country.
Awesome. Teo, anything you would add to that?
I would just second it. I mean, the fact that there is such it's essentially wage theft is a part of the business model for a huge number of businesses, means that we need to have every mechanism at our disposal to try to protect workers. And this is a really crucial one. It's a lot of money that gets where resources get diverted, and employers get a benefit because of this. Workers who are in an apprenticeship program, while they're in the training, part of their wage is paid through the program, right? So it's really incumbent on us to ensure that rights are being respected for anyone that is benefiting from that program.
Thanks. And Teo, you mentioned Michigan as an area that workers had seen success at the state level in getting some policies implemented. to protect them. And I'm wondering what other like states or regions are you seeing successes and where are you seeing challenges? And this can also be for Ollie or Allison if you have examples as well.
Sure. So, I mean, California, we have a very exciting and interesting experiment where fast food workers are seeing a wage of $20 an hour. And the latest data show that in fact the industry is continuing, that sector is still adding employees. One of the biggest arguments industry makes is that any such improvement in wages is going to lead to its demise, that they're going to have to close down. But in fact, we're seeing that that's not the case. The latest data show that the industry is in fact still growing. So that's really exciting. That's fast food, an industry that typically has 50% turnover. So anything that we can do to make those better jobs, it means that they'll also be better businesses and they'll be more, they'll see greater productivity as well. For some reason, well, I mean, we know why, because there's this incessant need to increase profit margins that prevents employers from seeing these things in a more rational way that would actually benefit workers. But some places where we still see tremendous challenges are all the states where the 16 states, for example, that have a $2.13 subminimum wage. In New Orleans, we're seeking to require restaurants to provide sexual harassment training to restaurant workers because of the fact that they depend on tips. Means that they have to really put up a lot from customers in order to make a living, right? And so it's really important that they be trained on how to protect themselves, on bystander intervention, et cetera. And so that's something that restaurants should have to play a role in, since they're benefiting from that low wage. There's a lot of states where they just preempt any increase to wage or any type of benefit. And all those places are also, we see higher rates of wage theft as well. So, I think those are just a couple of examples. There's many across the country.
Allison or Ollie, anything you'd want to add?
And I think as much as possible, it's so important for us to have these spaces on a national level where we're sharing kind of the good practices, best practices, and these stories, because while clearly in some states things are much worse than others, these are issues that nationwide workers are dealing with, right? And so looking at some of the innovative strategies that are occurring is so important. I know that in Illinois we're engaged right now in a quality jobs pilot where we're using our two of our state agencies, the Illinois Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, to fund a pilot program using WIOA money with 3 different geographically diverse areas in our state, trying to figure out what are these metrics? How do we make sure that the taxpayers are getting the best investment possible, right? And that the workers who are benefiting from these programs are being placed into actual good jobs and not just paying lip servicing. Like good jobs means that, they're following, the basic minimum standards, the floor of what the law requires, right? And so part of that, I'm feel very, very pleased that worker rights education and having that in a comprehensive manner all along the way, both of workers who are participating in the pilot and then also the frontline staff and then the business service agents who are engaging directly with the employers, all of them will be going through this kind of comprehensive training. And so, that is one little pilot in one state, but we are just kicking it off now. But I think that as much as possible, when we have these different initiatives that are going on, and that we can, be in communication and not just reinvent the wheel, learn from each other what's working, what's not working. I think that that's so important.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that, at Roosevelt and, in some of the work that I've done in the past is that we should always think about like a whole of government approach really to improving worker power and worker protections. And what that means is, you look at any possible avenue that really is out there to kind of make some of these changes. And so we know at the state level, again, state minimum wage policies have been really successful. In at the same instance, we also seen the opposite side of that, in terms of the slew of states who have really reduced their protections around child labor. And so it really is about, pushing labor laws at the state level where possible, but at the same time, not necessarily neglecting those states where, some of these state actions are very unlikely to pass muster just due to a lot of, legislative structures and gerrymandering. And so it's where, we have to also look at the federal government, whether it's the Department of Labor, the National Labor Relations Board, and really all government agencies that have any kind of impact on worker well-being as to how they can ultimately further just the working conditions of people in America. Because again, that's what America is. It is a country of workers.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I think right now we're seeing a lot of positive programs put forward through different DOL agencies like the Women's Bureau. We partner with them in their efforts to end gender-based violence and harassment. Just last week in Chicago, we trained 61 workers on heat illness prevention through OSHA Susan Harwood's program. And it's more than just wages that we're talking about. As climate change continues to create dangerous conditions, we see that restaurants, indoor workplaces and outdoor workplaces that don't have access to any cooling stations, that don't have access to water, are becoming more and more dangerous places to work. And these are important considerations as well in what is a good job.
Thanks so much. We have an audience question from Carlo. And I know that we have talked a lot about the restaurant industry in particular, because we do have a restaurant industry worker expert here with us. But wondering what other types of employers, aside from retail hospitality, are taking advantage of federal funding or might be, and would want to avoid like disclosing violations, or who might be, if you don't know like the specific numbers, obviously. But where are we seeing a lot of the violations in labor laws happening?
Well, I'll start with that. Something that I think has an industry that's grown just drastically over the past couple of decades is warehousing. And warehousing is now just along with construction some of the leading industries when it comes to health and safety violations. And these are a lot of businesses, and I think we can kind of think about which has a larger warehouse and transportation operations in the country, given the level of concentration that they've experienced. And these are places where we're seeing charges against them for the national, unfair labor practices under the National Labor Relations Act. We're seeing, again, health and safety violations. We're seeing wage violations, especially overtime violations there. And yet these are oftentimes the types of businesses that are looking at on-the-job training programs and at other kind of workforce development programming that is, again, either federally or state funded as a way to ultimately replenish their workforce. Oftentimes, these are relatively high turnover industries where just because of the level of labor violations and exploitation and relatively low wages, there's just a lot of churn in these industries. And so instead of them being able to be more competitive and improve, labor conditions and working conditions, they oftentimes just, capitalize on the existing workforce development programs as a way to just continue to, continue and regrow the pipeline for available workers. And it's really, again, it's not isolated to the restaurant industry and food service industry. It's not isolated to warehousing or construction, but these are just really some of the most common industries where these kind of practices take place and where employers under this, under the proposed WIOA provision are likely to be most impacted.
I think a lot about industries where misclassification is endemic. So construction being probably the most prevalent one. And so when workers are denied all the protections that they are afforded under the law because they're being considered and treated as independent contractors by their employers. That is, I think, a huge threat for workers everywhere, because that's, the ultimate cost saving way to, if you can cut your labor costs and just get rid of labor and call them independent contractors, that's very serious. Uh, Industries like retail, a lot of the same types of violations and issues that you see in restaurant work. But I think in retail, one thing that we focus on and have measured in our surveys of workers is the prevalence of just the variable and unpredictable scheduling. And so really, thinking about economic security for these workers and their families, not being able to predict how many hours you're going to have in the next paycheck, having, a slew of on-call work, mandatory on-call. That is, a whole new way of thinking about economic insecurity. And so as industries, different employers are, figuring out kind of cost saving measures and feeling pressures from their competitors, there, I think that this kind of use of variable, unpredictable scheduling and mandatory overtime and mandatory on-call work is becoming more the norm. And, not just retail, healthcare, most of our biggest industries, this can be found.
Thank you both for just illuminating how widespread this really is. And I think this will be our last question for the afternoon. But we've heard from folks who oppose this provision that really what this is going to do is hold up businesses that just are a little bit behind on their paperwork, and that it'll just add a bunch of red tape for businesses that are trying to do the right thing. And I'm just curious what you would say to that. Do you think that is the case and true? What are the benefits of having this kind of provision, even if it will require a little bit of additional paperwork?
Well, I think I would flip the argument on its side. And, the argument is that if these regulations are already required, this additional protection is not needed. If the employers are already complying with the law, there's not going to be any holdup, right? So anything that encourages employers interested in this benefit from making sure that they're compliant is going to be beneficial, both ultimately to them, so they're avoiding any legal liability, and of course to their workers.
Great. Thanks so much. And I would just love to have each of you do a wrap up, maybe your reflections on the conversation, where you would encourage folks to look into next, if they want to learn more about this or more about the work that you do, or just something that you're grappling with, or a question that you have for the panel, or maybe just for the general kind of field at large. So we can start with Ali.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm so grateful, one, that we have organizations like the Jobs Collaborative that are really able to, in New America, for able to bring so many different kind of voices together around a really important issue like workforce development policy. Workforce development policy is not the sexiest thing ever. However, it's extremely impactful. As Allison was kind of mentioning, there's so many dollars, there's so many workers who are flowing through these kinds of programs that, and yet at the same time, it's been a program that has largely undermined workers and worker well-being in so many ways. And so, to the extent that I think folks can gain much more familiarity, not just about, workforce development policy generally, but really what's happening in their own communities, what's happening in their own states around programming, like who are the beneficiaries of these dollars, and what kind of outcomes are workers ultimately seeing in their communities, and being able to kind of push back to make sure that there's improvements being made and accountability being had for the way that taxpayer money is ultimately being spent. And at the end, it really does require a cacophony of voices, folks from, again, the policy space, folks who are, like Bill, working with workers on the ground and providing workforce development training themselves, being able to set these kinds of new standards in what workers should be expecting, as well as obviously policymakers. So much of this is, it comes down to what the law is or isn't, and what protections are ultimately afforded to workers and which ones aren't. And so to the extent that I think, again, we can increase the salience of these kinds of workforce development policies and make sure that they really are serving workers and not just, again, providing, low road employers with an abundance of workers that they can ultimately exploit.
Allison, I saw you nodding quite a bit. What would you add?
I think that these three pieces of the puzzle that Teo, Ali, and I represent are fundamental, right? And so really for everybody, going back to their own jurisdiction, thinking like, who are the folks who are engaging in providing education of workers, right? Who are those people? What kind of intervention can we make there? Who are the people who are the advocates in our community who are striving for stronger protections, and really, robust enforcement, fully funded enforcement mechanisms? And who are those who are actually working with organizers to help them organize into to organizations, whether they are, labor unions or other types of representation that can, really strive to not only protect their rights on the job, but improve those working conditions. I think that without the pressure from those three pieces, you're gonna have any efforts really fall short. So all of us exist in every single state, so it's just kind of a matter of identifying those resources.
Great. And last but not least, Teo.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I want to invite everybody to go to our website, rocunited.org, and hopefully make a donation. I have two members on my mind. One is Alima, who spoke at a previous Good Jobs Collaborative event and noted how important it was to learn how to make a resume and how to go through the application process here in the US, as an immigrant from, I believe, Uzbekistan. So, that shows just the importance of just the soft skills that we're helping with. Shamari is a member of ours who started through our bartender training program, and is now a sommelier, and is really leading a very thriving existence in the industry, which, and as I mentioned, those opportunities are there and they should be available to everybody. We're really excited to move forward our registered apprenticeship program. We're right now working with the New York DOL to get those programs approved so we can work towards professionalizing the industry as a way of, one, encouraging greater wage opportunities for everybody, but also ensuring that wages and working conditions continue to rise. The more we professionalize the industry, the better it'll be for everybody that works in it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you three so much for joining us this afternoon. I know I certainly learn something from each of you every time we talk, and I hope that our audience enjoyed hearing from you at least as much as I did. And I want to thank our New America communications team who has helped us put this on, as well as all of the members of the Good Jobs Collaborative for the work that they are doing on a daily basis to fight for workers and their rights. So with that, I will say thank you for joining, and I'll see you at the next Good Jobs Collaborative.